The HOA Karen called 911, reporting me as an armed terrorist because I wouldn't let her inspect my curtains. Standing at my door screaming about hostages while I drank coffee, she had no idea the dispatcher was my wife Rachel, who'd already taken 23 fake emergency calls from this same woman. What followed was the most spectacular downfall in HOA history. Helicopters, SWAT teams, and a price tag that would make your jaw drop. If you're watching from anywhere with a psycho HOA president, comment below, because this is how my wife destroyed the most hated woman in Denver without leaving her desk. Looking back now, I should have seen the warning signs when we first toured Sunset Ridge Estates 8 months ago. The realtor kept emphasizing words like exclusive community standards and harmonious living environment while showing us around the pristine streets where every lawn was exactly 2.5 inches tall, every mailbox stood at precisely 42 inches from the ground, and every house sported the same approved shade of beige that I later learned was called Desert Sand, number 12. My wife Rachel and I had just moved from Texas with our 10-year-old daughter Sophie, seeking a quieter life after years in Houston's chaos, and this Denver suburb seemed perfect with its mountain views and top-rated schools. The HOA fees were steep at $350 monthly, but the realtor assured us it was worth it for the premium lifestyle maintenance, which I assumed meant nice landscaping and maybe some community events, not the dictatorial regime we were about to experience. The HOA rulebook should have been my first red flag, because it was thicker than a Harry Potter novel and contained 147 distinct regulations covering everything from the acceptable height of garden gnomes, which was 0 inches because they were banned entirely, to the precise angle at which American flags could be displayed, which was 75 degrees from horizontal, no more, no less. But we were exhausted from the move. Sophie was excited about her new school, and Rachel had just started her position at the Denver Emergency Communications Center. So we signed the papers and moved into our dream home at 125 Sunset Ridge Drive, blissfully unaware that we'd just entered the domain of Karen Whitfield, self-appointed queen of the neighborhood and HOA president for 8 consecutive years. Karen made her first appearance exactly 3 days after we moved in, arriving at our doorstep at 6:30 in the morning with a welcome basket that contained HOA violation notices for infractions we'd apparently already committed, including leaving our moving boxes visible from the street for more than 24 hours and having a doormat that was Sahara Sunset instead of the approved Desert Sand. She stood there in her signature pastel pink pantsuit that looked 2 sizes too small, clutching her official HOA clipboard like it was a sacred tablet, her bleach blonde hair sprayed into a helmet that defied both gravity and good taste, explaining in excruciating detail how our infractions disrupted the aesthetic harmony of Sunset Ridge. Rachel, still in her pajamas and pre-coffee state, managed to smile and nod while I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood, both of us thinking this had to be some kind of hazing ritual for new residents that would surely calm down once we settled in. How wrong we were became clear over the following weeks as Karen's routine patrols became daily occurrences, complete with her measuring tape, professional camera with telephoto lens, and a tablet where she documented every perceived transgression in what she called her community excellence database. She would walk past our house at precisely 6 in the morning, often stopping to photograph our windows from various angles or measure the distance from our front door to the mailbox, occasionally even pulling out a color swatch card to compare against our exterior paint. Sophie started calling her the witch with the magic board, after witnessing Karen spend 20 minutes photographing our garden hose that had been left coiled imperfectly, and even our 10-year-old could sense something was off about this woman who seemed to have nothing better to do than police her neighbors' lives. The real trouble started when I made the fatal mistake of correcting Karen during an HOA meeting about 6 weeks after we moved in. She was explaining how the HOA owned the first 5 feet of everyone's driveway, which meant she had the authority to inspect and regulate anything within that zone, when I politely raised my hand and pointed out that according to the actual property deeds and city records, homeowners owned their driveways entirely, and the HOA only had easement rights for utility access. The look she gave me could have curdled milk from 50 paces, her face turning a shade of red that definitely wasn't in the approved color palette, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees as she slowly turned her laser focus directly on me, marking me as enemy number 1 in her perfectly ordered kingdom. After that meeting, our house became ground zero for Karen's enhanced scrutiny campaign, with inspection notices arriving almost daily for increasingly absurd violations like inconsistent grass blade height in Sector 4 of front lawn, and mailbox numbers exhibiting excessive shine in afternoon sun. Rachel, who spent her days dealing with actual emergencies, would come home to find new notices tucked into our door and laugh that bitter laugh of someone trying not to scream, saying things like, "At least my crazies at work have real problems. This woman manufactures them from thin air and measuring tape." But we tried to stay calm, documenting everything, responding professionally to each notice, even when Karen started her 6 a.m. photography sessions focusing specifically on our windows, claiming she needed to monitor for seasonal decoration compliance, even though it was the middle of July with no holidays in sight. I'd installed security cameras after her third inspection visit, and reviewing the footage became our nightly entertainment in a dark, twisted way. We'd watch Karen spend 15 minutes measuring the gap between our garbage cans, or the time she brought a protractor to calculate the exact angle of our welcome mat, all while muttering to herself and scribbling furiously on her clipboard like a scientist documenting a new species of suburban violation. The breaking point, the moment that would lead to the most insane 911 call in Sunset Ridge history, came on a Tuesday morning when I was working from home and Sophie was at school, leaving me alone to face what was about to unfold. I'd taken the day off from my software engineering job to catch up on some coding projects in peace, brewing my favorite coffee and settling into my home office, when the doorbell started ringing with an aggressive urgency that could only mean one thing. Looking through the peephole, I saw Karen standing there in a mint green pantsuit that seemed to vibrate with righteous indignation, holding not just her regular clipboard, but an entire briefcase that she'd labeled Inspection Kit version 3.0 in laminated letters. Her face set in an expression of grim determination that meant today was going to be anything but peaceful. The briefcase itself was a marvel of obsessive organization, with foam cutouts holding a magnifying glass, multiple color swatches, a light meter, and what appeared to be a decibel reader, presumably to measure if our curtains made too much noise when drawn. Watching her struggle to balance this 20-pound monstrosity while maintaining her aggressive doorbell assault would have been hilarious if it wasn't so disturbing. Karen Whitfield's rise to power in Sunset Ridge Estates was the kind of origin story that would be almost pitiable if she hadn't turned her personal disappointments into everyone else's nightmare. According to Maggie Foster, our 78-year-old neighbor who'd lived here since the development was built and kept meticulous records of everything, Karen's obsession with control started after she lost the Miss Denver County pageant in 1990 by giving what might be the worst answer in pageant history when asked about her vision for world peace, responding with, "World peace sounds nice, but I just want to win this crown and prove I'm better than these other girls." The judges were reportedly so stunned that the awkward silence lasted a full 15 seconds before they moved on to the next contestant, and Karen placed dead last. A humiliation that apparently festered for decades and transformed into a pathological need to control everything and everyone around her. Her husband, Richard, a successful corporate lawyer who specialized in mergers and acquisitions, spent approximately 3 days per month at home, leaving signed checks on the kitchen counter and treating Karen with the kind of distant politeness usually reserved for hotel staff. Their daughter Ashley, now 28 and running for city council, had once confided to another neighbor that she was embarrassed by her mother's behavior, but felt trapped because Karen had tied the family's reputation so tightly to Sunset Ridge's perfection that any crack in the facade would damage Ashley's political aspirations. The campaign slogan, "Raised in Perfection, Leading to Excellence," was plastered on signs throughout the neighborhood, each one personally approved by Karen for placement and angle, creating a constant reminder that Sunset Ridge wasn't just a neighborhood, but a political prop that needed to maintain its artificial shine at all costs. Karen's Karenology manual, as she genuinely called her self-published guide to neighborhood management without any sense of irony, contained gems like "compliance is love" and "uniformity equals unity," along with detailed charts showing the exact RGB values for approved paint colors and mathematical formulas for calculating optimal hedge heights based on proximity to sidewalk. She'd distributed copies to all board members, who were mostly too intimidated to point out that half the regulations she enforced weren't actually in the official HOA bylaws, but were instead products of her increasingly unhinged interpretation of what community standards meant. The manual even included a section on preemptive violation prevention, which encouraged board members to issue warnings for things that might become violations in the future, a concept so absurd that even her most loyal supporters privately questioned her sanity. The casualties of Karen's 8-year reign were numerous and well documented. thanks to neighbors like Maggie, who kept records of every family driven out by excessive fines and harassment. The Hendersons, an elderly couple who'd lived here for 15 years, were forced to sell after receiving 47 violations in 6 months for things like grass exceeding 2.5 inches in northeastern quadrant of lawn measured at 6 a.m. when dew made accurate measurement impossible, and bird feeder attracting non-approved avian species because apparently cardinals were fine but blue jays were considered too noisy for community standards. The final straw came when Karen fined them $500 for their grandson's chalk drawings on their own driveway, claiming they represented graffiti precursors that could inspire actual vandalism. And the Hendersons sold their house at a loss just to escape what they called the pastel tyrant. The Millers, a young family with 3 kids, lasted only 4 months before fleeing Karen's reign of terror. Their crime? Their children drew hopscotch squares with washable chalk on their own driveway. Karen photographed it from 17 angles and issued $2,000 in fines for permanent defacement of community property, even though rain washed. The youngest Miller child had drawn a rainbow over their house, which Karen documented as unauthorized use of non-regulated color spectrums, and tried to fine them an additional $300. My own history with Karen took a sharp turn after that HOA meeting where I'd corrected her about driveway ownership, transforming me from just another resident to her primary target. The security cameras I'd installed after her first early morning photography session had captured increasingly bizarre behavior, including Karen measuring the gap between our window blinds with a laser distance meter, photographing our trash cans from multiple angles to document improper lid alignment, and on one memorable occasion actually getting on our hands and knees to smell our freshly painted mailbox post to determine if we'd used the approved brand of paint. When I mentioned this to Rachel, she pulled up Karen's call history at dispatch, and her face went pale as she counted 23 different 911 calls over 2 years, ranging from suspicious cat loitering with intent, to neighbors' barbecue smoke forming threatening patterns, to children playing basketball after 6 p.m., creating acoustic terrorism. The week before the incident that would finally bring Karen's empire crashing down, she'd sent out a neighborhood-wide email announcing new seasonal interior harmony inspections that would require residents to allow board members inside their homes to verify that window treatments, visible furniture, and even book spines on shelves met community standards for visual cohesion when viewed from common areas. The email was so unhinged that Ashley Whitfield herself texted her mother, begging her to retract it, warning that reporters were starting to sniff around the story and that nobody wants to vote for someone raised by a dictator mom. But Karen deleted the text and doubled down, creating a schedule that put our house first on the inspection list, circled in red ink 3 times for emphasis. That Tuesday morning when she arrived with her inspection kit version 3.0, I'd already reviewed the actual HOA bylaws, state property laws, and even consulted with a lawyer friend who confirmed what I already knew. Karen had absolutely zero legal authority to demand entry to anyone's home for aesthetic inspections, and her made-up rules weren't worth the paper they were printed on. But knowing your rights and enforcing them against someone who's convinced they're the supreme authority of a 6-block radius are 2 very different things, especially when that someone has a history of weaponizing emergency services against anyone who dares to challenge their delusional empire of pastel power and clipboard tyranny. The doorbell rang with machine gun persistence, 15 rapid-fire dings that announced Karen's arrival with all the subtlety of an air raid siren, and I deliberately took my time walking to the door, each step measured and calm, because I knew that showing any urgency would only feed her sense of importance. Through the peephole, I could see her standing there in that mint-green pantsuit that looked like it had been spray-painted onto her body, her face already flushed with anticipation of the confrontation she'd been planning probably since 4 a.m., when normal people were still sleeping, but Karen was already plotting her next move in the endless chess game she played against her neighbor's freedom. I took a deep breath, reminded myself of the security cameras recording everything, thought about Rachel's advice to stay calm because these types feed on drama, and opened the door exactly wide enough to have a conversation, but not wide enough to suggest any invitation to enter. "Mr. Brooks," she began, not even attempting a greeting, her voice dripping with the kind of false authority that comes from years of nobody challenging your delusions. I'm here for the scheduled interior ambiance compliance inspection, as outlined in Section 74.3b of the Community Guidelines Addendum, which clearly states that board members have the right to verify aesthetic standards are being maintained within primary living spaces visible from common areas. She actually said this in one breath, like she'd rehearsed it in front of a mirror, while fumbling with her briefcase to pull out a laminated checklist that appeared to be color-coded with at least 12 different highlighting schemes. The morning sun caught her hairspray in a way that created an almost supernatural halo effect, if halos were made of chemicals and entitlement, and I noticed she'd brought a photographer's loop hanging around her neck like she was about to appraise diamonds instead of terrorize a family over curtain choices. "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Whitfield," I responded, keeping my voice deliberately pleasant, which I knew would annoy her more than any hostility could. "I'm not aware of any scheduled inspection, and I'm fairly certain Section 74.3b refers to swimming pool maintenance, which is interesting since I don't have a pool, unless you're counting the puddle in my driveway from last night's sprinklers, which I suppose could be considered a water feature if we're being creative with definitions." The flash of confusion that crossed her face was priceless as she realized I'd actually read the bylaws, something most residents never bothered to do, assuming Karen's word was law. But I'd spent 3 hours last night going through every single page of that bureaucratic nightmare specifically to prepare for this moment. She recovered quickly, though, the kind of mental gymnastics that comes from years of never admitting error, and thrust her clipboard forward like a battle standard. "I meant Section 74.3b subsection 2, regarding interior visible standards, as established by the board in the 2021 special session, which you would know about if you attended meetings regularly instead of hiding behind your curtains, which, by the way, I've noticed don't match the approved seasonal color transition schedule we distributed last month." The way she said "hiding behind your curtains" with such venom made it clear this wasn't really about window treatments, but about power, control, and her desperate need to prove that she mattered in a world that had largely forgotten she existed beyond these 6 blocks of suburban purgatory. "Mrs. Whitfield," I said, leaning against my doorframe in what I hoped was a picture of relaxed confidence, even though my heart was starting to race with the adrenaline of confrontation. "I appreciate your dedication to the neighborhood, truly I do, but unless you have a warrant signed by an actual judge or can show me a legitimate legal statute that grants you the right to enter my private property for an interior inspection, you're not coming into my home today, tomorrow, or any other day that ends in "wa." I watched her face cycle through several shades of red that definitely weren't in her approved color palette, her free hand clenching and unclenching like she was imagining strangling me with her measuring tape, while behind me I could hear my coffee maker beeping to indicate my brew was ready, a sound that somehow made this whole situation even more surreal. "Are you refusing an official HOA inspection?" she asked, her voice rising to a pitch that probably had dogs barking 3 blocks away. "Do you understand the implications of non-compliance with board directives? I have the authority to fine you up to $500 per day for obstruction of community standards enforcement, and I will not hesitate to use every tool at my disposal to ensure the integrity of this neighborhood remains intact." She actually stamped her foot on the word integrity, like a toddler having a tantrum, if toddlers wore too tight pantsuits and carried briefcases full of fabricated violation notices. I noticed our across-the-street neighbor peeking through their blinds, probably grateful it wasn't their turn to face the wrath of Karen, and I wondered how many similar confrontations had played out on these perfectly manicured doorsteps over the years. That's when things took the turn that would change everything, as Karen pulled out her phone and held it up like a weapon, her eyes glittering with the kind of vindictive triumph that comes from believing you hold all the cards. "If you're going to be uncooperative and hostile, Mr. Brooks, displaying aggressive behavior toward an elected community representative simply trying to perform her duties for the betterment of all residents, then I have no choice but to contact the authorities and let them handle your belligerence appropriately." The way she said aggressive behavior while I was literally just standing in my own doorway drinking coffee would have been funny if it wasn't so insane, and as she started dialing, I made a decision that would either be the smartest or dumbest thing I'd done since moving to Sunset Ridge. I called her bluff and said the words that would trigger the most spectacular meltdown and explain how I'm threatening you by refusing to let you inspect my curtain rods. Meanwhile, 3 miles away at the Denver Emergency Communications Center, my wife Rachel was halfway through her morning shift, sipping her 3rd cup of coffee that had long gone cold but still provided the caffeine necessary to deal with the parade of humanity's worst moments that flowed through her headset every day. Her colleague Jake had just finished handling a fender bender on Interstate 70 when he glanced over at Rachel with that knowing look they'd developed over years of working together. The one that said, "incoming crazy," without words, because certain addresses had become as familiar as their own homes. And Sunset Ridge Estates was definitely on their frequent flyer list. Rachel had been a dispatcher for 10 years, following in the footsteps of her father who'd been police chief before retiring, and she'd developed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm, no matter what chaos erupted in her earpiece. But even she had limits, and Karen Whitfield had been testing those limits for 2 solid years. The call came in at 10:17 a.m., the display showing the familiar Sunset Ridge prefix that made Rachel's stomach tighten with a mixture of dread and dark amusement, because she'd been tracking Karen's calls in her own personal database, a side project born from morbid curiosity about just how often one person could abuse emergency services for non-emergencies. 23 times in 24 months. Ranging from the infamous suspicious cat incident where Karen claimed a neighbor's black cat was casing houses with criminal intent, to the acoustic terrorism complaint about children playing basketball, each call more absurd than the last, yet somehow never quite crossing the line into prosecutable false reporting because Karen was careful to use words like concerned and potentially and might be to cover her tracks legally while still wasting thousands of dollars in resources. The worst had been last 4th of July, when Karen reported the Johnson's barbecue as bioterrorism via meat smoke deployment against vegetarian neighbors, demanding a hazmat team for what was literally just hamburgers on a grill. The dispatch center had started an informal betting pool on Karen's next call, with Jake winning $20 last month by correctly predicting she'd report temporal holiday violations when someone put up Christmas lights before Thanksgiving. 911, what's your emergency? Rachel answered with her practiced, professional tone, already knowing who would be on the other end but following protocol to the letter, because one thing her father had taught her was that documentation was everything in this job. "Yes, this is Karen Whitfield, president of the Sunset Ridge Estates Homeowners Association," came the shrill voice that Rachel could identify from just those first few words, the self-important tone that suggested being HOA president was equivalent to being Secretary of State. "I need to report a hostile individual who is refusing to comply with lawful community directives and displaying aggressive behavior that makes me fear for my safety." The way Karen emphasized certain words like she was reading from a script she'd memorized from watching too many crime shows would have been amusing if it wasn't such a waste of emergency resources. Rachel muted her microphone for a split second, just long enough to whisper, "Oh God, not again," before returning to full professional mode, her fingers already flying across the keyboard to start the incident report that would become evidence in ways Karen couldn't imagine. "Ma'am, can you tell me your exact location and describe the nature of the threat?" she asked, following the standard protocol even though she recognized not just the voice but the address that popped up on her screen, her home address, which meant Karen was standing on her doorstep harassing her husband while she sat here pretending not to know what was happening. The irony was so thick you could cut it with one of Karen's laminated violation notices, but Rachel kept her voice steady, neutral, giving nothing away, even as Jake glanced over with raised eyebrows, sensing something interesting was developing. "I'm at 125 Sunset Ridge Drive, attempting to conduct a routine inspection of community standards compliance," Karen continued, her voice rising with each word, "and the male resident, a Mr. Nathan Brooks, is blocking the doorway and refusing me entry, in direct violation of HOA bylaws section 74.3b subsection 2, which clearly grants board members the right to verify interior aesthetic compliance during reasonable hours." The way she rattled off the fake bylaw numbers with such confidence spoke to either impressive memorization skills or complete detachment from reality, possibly both. Rachel typed every word verbatim, knowing that accurate documentation would be crucial, while mentally calculating that this was now the 24th call from Karen, which according to department policy and state law crossed the threshold from nuisance to criminal pattern. "Ma'am, is the resident physically threatening you or displaying any weapons?" Rachel asked, following the threat assessment protocol while already knowing the answer because she knew her husband, knew he was probably standing there with his coffee mug looking more bemused than belligerent. Well, Karen hesitated, clearly trying to figure out how to make a man standing in his own doorway sound menacing. He's holding something in his hand, could be a weapon, it's metallic and steaming, and his posture is very aggressive, blocking the door like he's hiding something criminal inside. Rachel had to bite her lip to keep from laughing at the description of Nathan's coffee mug as a potential weapon, but she dutifully typed, "Caller reports resident holding metallic object with steam, possibly hot beverage," into the report. Has he made any verbal threats or threatening gestures? Rachel continued, building the record that would eventually bury Karen in her own words. "He told me I couldn't come in without a warrant," Karen shrieked, as if requiring legal documentation for forced entry was itself a crime. "He's obstructing an official investigation. This is about more than curtains, officer. I mean dispatcher. This is about the complete breakdown of social order. If residents can just refuse lawful inspections, what's next? Anarchy, chaos, property values plummeting?" The hyperbolic escalation from curtain inspection to societal collapse was impressive, even by Karen's standards, and Rachel made sure to capture every word, knowing that when played back in court it would sound exactly as unhinged as it was. While Jake, who had been listening to Rachel's side of the conversation, pulled up the address and whispered, "Isn't that your house?" with a mixture of concern and barely suppressed amusement. Rachel nodded silently to Jake while maintaining her professional composure, typing a quick note in the system that said, "Caller appears to be escalating without cause," as Karen's voice continued to rise through the headset, reaching pitches that probably violated some noise ordinance she herself had created. "I need officers here immediately. This man is a menace to our community. Do you know how hard I've worked to maintain standards in this neighborhood? 8 years. 8 years of my life dedicated to making Sunset Ridge Estates a beacon of perfection for my daughter's future. And residents like him think they can just destroy everything with their non-compliance and their hostile attitudes?" The admission slipped out so naturally that Karen didn't even realize she'd just confessed to using her HOA position for personal political gain. But Rachel caught it, highlighted it in the report, and added a note about caller admitting to personal agenda in enforcement actions. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down and describe exactly what the resident is doing right now," Rachel said, using her de-escalation voice, even though part of her wanted to escalate things just to see how far Karen would go. Through the computer system, she could see that Captain Thompson was on duty, the same captain who had responded to Karen's last 2 calls about suspicious garden gnome frequencies and who had warned Karen about the consequences of false reporting. Rachel flagged the call for his attention, knowing he would want to handle this personally, especially given that this was now officially the 24th instance of Karen abusing emergency services, a pattern that had cost the city thousands in wasted resources. What he's doing? He's standing there, menacingly, drinking his weapon, his coffee. How do I know it's coffee? It could be anything. He could be brewing illegal substances. I smell something suspicious? Yes, definitely suspicious. Odors that could indicate drug manufacturing. Karen was spiraling now, her accusations becoming more outlandish with each sentence, desperately trying to manufacture probable cause from thin air and coffee steam. And there's sounds coming from inside, like a child crying. He could be holding someone hostage. Child endangerment. Yes, I definitely hear distress. Rachel knew that child was probably their television, or maybe Sophie's cat, but she documented every claim, building the rope that Karen was enthusiastically using to hang herself. "You're reporting possible drug manufacturing and a hostage situation?" Rachel clarified, making sure her tone conveyed just enough skepticism to be legal, but not enough to be unprofessional. "Ma'am, these are very serious allegations. Making false reports to emergency services is a felony offense that can result in significant fines and jail time. Are you absolutely certain about what you're witnessing?" This was the moment where a rational person would backtrack, realize they'd gone too far, maybe admit they were exaggerating. But Karen Whitfield hadn't been rational since she lost that pageant 33 years ago. And rational people didn't measure their neighbor's grass with rulers at dawn. "Are you questioning my integrity?" Karen screeched, the indignation in her voice reaching levels that probably registered on seismographs. "I am a pillar of this community. My husband is Richard Whitfield of Whitfield Barnes and Associates. My daughter Ashley is running for city council on a platform of law and order. I know what I see, and what I see is a dangerous individual who needs to be stopped before he destroys everything everything our community has worked for." Another slip, another admission that this was all about her control, her daughter's political career, built on the facade of a perfect neighborhood that existed only in her heavily medicated imagination. Rachel pulled up the history of Karen's calls, each one meticulously documented with recordings and transcripts. A pattern of escalation that started with noise complaints and had now reached accusations of drug manufacturing and hostage situations, all because Nathan wouldn't let her inspect their curtains. She did a quick calculation. 24 false reports, average response cost of $2,000 per incident, total waste of $48,000 in city resources, not counting the stress on emergency responders, and the real emergencies that might have been delayed while officers dealt with Karen's fantasy crimes. The numbers alone would be damning, but combined with the recordings of Karen admitting her personal motivations, it was a prosecutorial slam dunk waiting to happen. Based on your allegations of drug manufacturing, potential weapons, and a possible hostage situation, we'll be dispatching multiple units to respond to this high-priority call, Rachel said, following protocol to the letter, because when someone makes claims this serious, the department has to respond accordingly, even when they know it's fabricated. Please remain at a safe distance from the residents and stay on the line. Officers are being notified of a potentially armed and dangerous subject who has barricaded himself inside with possible hostages. She could practically hear Karen smile through the phone. The vindictive satisfaction of someone who thought they'd won, completely unaware that they'd just ordered their own professional execution with extra sirens on top. Finally, someone who takes community safety seriously, Karen exclaimed. Send everyone, SWAT, helicopters, drug dogs, whatever it takes. I'm feeling very stressed by this situation. My heart is racing. I might need medical attention too. This hostile environment he's created is threatening my health. I demand a full response, maximum force. I want him to understand that you cannot disrespect the HOA president and get away with it. And there it was, the final nail in her self-built coffin. The admission that this was about respect and power, not safety or community standards or any of the lies she'd been spinning for 8 years. Rachel marked the timestamp, added a note about caller requesting excessive force for personal reasons, and prepared to dispatch the response that Karen had demanded, knowing that sometimes the best way to teach someone about consequences is to give them exactly what they ask for. The first siren started as a distant wail, probably coming from the station 6 blocks away, and I watched through my window as Karen's face lit up with the kind of joy usually reserved for lottery winners or supervillains whose doomsday devices finally work. She was still on the phone, gesturing wildly at my house like she was directing air traffic, her mint green pantsuit practically glowing in the morning sun as she positioned herself for what she clearly thought would be her moment of ultimate triumph. Then came the second siren from a different direction, then a third, and soon our quiet suburban street was filling with the sound of what happens when you cry wolf 24 times and the emergency response system decides to take you at your word for every ridiculous claim you've made. The first police cruiser screamed around the corner and pulled up diagonally across the street, followed immediately by another, then another, officers emerging with hands on their holsters because the dispatch had said potentially armed and dangerous suspect with possible hostages, not middle-aged software engineer with a coffee mug and reasonable boundaries. Karen was practically dancing now, waving her arms at the officers, pointing at my house while shouting things like, "He's in there, the dangerous one, be careful, he has weapons," while I stood perfectly still at my window, hands visible, trying to project an aura of "I'm the sane one here" to the growing army of law enforcement assembling on my lawn. Then came the sound that made even Karen pause in her victory dance, the distinctive whoomp 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 of helicopter blades cutting through the air. I looked up to see not a news chopper, but an actual police helicopter circling overhead, its searchlight sweeping across my front yard in broad daylight. Because apparently when you request everything, that's exactly what you get. The downdraft from the rotors sent Karen's perfectly sprayed hair into chaos, transforming her helmet of blonde into something that looked like she'd been electrocuted, while neighbors started emerging from their houses, phones in hand, recording what was rapidly becoming the most exciting thing to happen on Sunset Ridge Drive since the great snowstorm of 2019. More vehicles arrived, a massive police SUV that looked like it could survive a zombie apocalypse, a fire truck that rumbled down our narrow street like a confused dinosaur, and an ambulance whose paramedics emerged looking around with expressions that clearly said, "What fresh hell is this?" Captain Thompson himself stepped out of the SUV, took one look at Karen, who was now trying to direct the operation like a demented traffic controller, and I could see his shoulders slump with the weight of a man who dealt with her nonsense too many times. He approached her while barking orders into his radio, probably telling the helicopter that no, they didn't actually need air support for a curtain inspection gone wrong. I decided it was time to step outside before someone got the bright idea to use the battering ram I could see in the back of one of the vehicles, so I slowly opened my front door, hands raised but still holding my coffee mug because damned if I was going to let it go cold over this insanity. "Officers, I called out in my calmest voice, the one I used for particularly difficult code reviews. "I'm Nathan Brooks, the homeowner. There's been a significant misunderstanding here. I simply refuse to allow Mrs. Whitfield to enter my home for an unauthorized HOA inspection. There are no weapons, no drugs, no hostages, just a man trying to enjoy his morning coffee in peace." Captain Thompson looked from me to Karen, then back to me, his face cycling through several expressions before settling on one that combined exhaustion, anger, and resigned amusement. "Mr. Brooks, we received a report of drug manufacturing, weapons, and a potential hostage situation," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, including the growing crowd of neighbors and the news van that had just pulled up because of course someone had called them. Karen tried to interrupt, but Thompson held up a hand that brooked no argument. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is the 4th time in 6 months you've called in a false emergency. We've warned you repeatedly about the consequences of abusing emergency services." That's when Maggie Foster made her entrance, and it was glorious. Our 78-year-old neighbor walked straight through the police line like she owned it, carrying a leather folder that looked older than some of the officers present. "Captain Thompson," she said in a voice that had probably commanded courtrooms back in her day, "I've been documenting Mrs. Whitfield's abuse of power for 8 years. Every false violation, every illegal fine, every family she's driven from this neighborhood with her harassment. I also have recordings from HOA meetings where she explicitly stated that rules don't need to be logical or legal, they just need to control residents." She handed over the folder with the gravity of someone delivering state secrets, and I saw Karen's face go from red to white to a shade of green that matched her pantsuit. The coup de grace came from an unexpected source. Ashley Whitfield's black Tesla pulled up and Karen's daughter emerged looking like she'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "Mother," she shouted over the chaos, her political composure completely shattered. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This is being live streamed. My campaign manager just called 3 news stations are on their way. Did you actually tell them Nathan was manufacturing drugs? Drugs, Mother? The man who helps coach Sophie's robotics team?" The horror in her voice was palpable as she realized her carefully crafted image of being raised in perfection was crumbling faster than Karen's hair in the helicopter downdraft, and somewhere in the crowd I heard someone whisper, "This is better than reality TV," which honestly was hard to argue with as our HOA president's empire collapsed in real time, broadcast to the entire city. The final destruction of Karen Whitfield's 8-year reign of terror came not with handcuffs, though those appeared eventually, but with the slow, methodical reading of charges by Captain Thompson while the entire neighborhood watched and recorded. "Mrs. Whitfield, you're being charged with multiple counts of false reporting, abuse of emergency services, and filing false police reports," he announced, his voice carrying across the crowd that had grown to include what seemed like every resident of Sunset Ridge Estates, plus a few food delivery drivers who'd stopped to watch the show. "The total cost of today's response, including helicopter deployment, multiple units, and emergency medical standby, comes to approximately $38,000, which the city will be seeking to recover through civil proceedings." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her brain apparently unable to process how her perfect plan had backfired so spectacularly. But he refused inspection. He was hostile. "My husband is a lawyer. Richard will sue all of you." She looked around frantically for support, but Richard Whitfield was notably absent, though I later learned he'd been watching the live stream from his office and had immediately called his divorce attorney, deciding that 30 years of marriage wasn't worth being associated with this level of public humiliation. The neighbors she'd terrorized for years stood silent, their phones recording every second, and I could see the exact moment when Karen realized she'd become the villain in her own story. The handcuffs came out when Karen tried to lunge at Maggie Foster, screaming about traitors and destroying her life's work, but she didn't get far before 2 officers gently but firmly restrained her. As they led her to the cruiser, she kept shouting about her daughter's campaign, how this was ruining everything, how we'd all regret the day we crossed her. But the words bounced off the crowd like rain off umbrellas, meaningless noise from someone whose power had evaporated faster than morning dew in the desert. Ashley stood frozen by her Tesla, tears streaming down her face as she watched her mother's meltdown, and I actually felt sorry for her until she grabbed her phone and posted a statement, distancing herself from her mother's actions, proving that political survival instincts run in the family. The emergency HOA meeting that night was held in our garage because Karen, in her infinite wisdom, had changed the locks on the community center and nobody else had keys. 134 residents crammed into the space between my workbench and Rachel's car, the mood alternating between celebration and shell shock as we tried to process what had happened. Maggie Foster was unanimously elected interim president after giving a 30-second speech that consisted mainly of, "I promise to leave you all alone unless there's an actual problem," which got a standing ovation. The vote to remove Karen was 134-0, with 3 abstentions from elderly residents who'd fallen asleep during the heated discussion about whether to pursue additional legal action against her. The real satisfaction came 6 months later when the final tallies were in. Karen faced $67,000 in total fines and restitution, including the emergency response costs, 8 years of illegally collected fines that had to be refunded, and punitive damages for harassment. She'd pled guilty to multiple misdemeanors to avoid felony charges, served 30 days in county jail, and was required to complete 100 hours of community service, specifically focused on appropriate use of emergency services, taught by none other than retired emergency dispatchers who found her presence in their classes deliciously ironic. The Whitfield house went on the market within 3 months, selling at a significant loss because, as the realtor admitted, everyone in Denver knows about the Sunset Ridge Karen. Our neighborhood transformed almost overnight from a place of fear and rigid conformity to an actual community where people felt free to exist without measuring their grass with rulers. The new HOA board, led by Maggie's practical wisdom, eliminated 141 of Karen's 147 rules, keeping only the ones that made actual sense, like don't park boats on your front lawn, and please pick up after your dogs. Property values, rather than plummeting, as Karen had predicted, actually increased as word spread that Sunset Ridge Estates was now a place where you could hang whatever color curtains you wanted without fearing the wrath of a pantsuit-wearing dictator with a clipboard. The first annual Freedom Festival was held on the anniversary of Karen's arrest, with every house displaying deliberately mismatched decorations, rainbow curtains, and yard art that would have given Karen an aneurysm. Nathan's contribution was installing LED curtains that changed color every hour, cycling through patterns that definitely weren't in any approved palette. Sophie and the other neighborhood kids created a massive chalk mural on the street spelling out "Homes of Acceptance," and nobody said a word about permits or property damage because we'd all learned what really mattered. Even crusty old Mr. Henderson, who'd moved back into his old house after Karen's departure, planted his grass exactly 3 inches tall just because he could, calling it an act of rebellion and remembrance. Rachel received the Dispatcher of the Year award with a special commendation for maintaining professionalism under extraordinary circumstances, though she admitted later that listening to Karen demand a SWAT team for curtain inspection while knowing it was our curtains had tested every ounce of her training. During her acceptance speech, she thanked her husband for refusing to let crazy win and the entire Sunset Ridge community for providing the most entertaining shift of her career, getting a standing ovation from her colleagues who'd all dealt with their own versions of Karen over the years. The ceremony was held at our community center, which now had normal locks that multiple people had keys to, a small but significant symbol of how much had changed. During the ceremony, Rachel surprised everyone by reading a letter from Mr. Henderson, who'd bought back his old house after Karen's downfall. His words brought tears to hardened emergency responders. My wife Martha passed away thinking we'd failed at the American dream because we couldn't stand up to a bully. Thank you for showing that sometimes justice comes when good people finally say enough. I just wish Martha could see her roses blooming again without fear of measuring tape. The room fell silent except for sniffles, a powerful reminder that Karen's tyranny had real human costs beyond fines and violations. As I stand here today in my home office, looking out through my LED rainbow curtains at our peaceful street where kids play freely and neighbors wave without fear of violation notices, I can't help but reflect on the lesson Karen inadvertently taught us all. Petty tyrants only have the power we give them, and sometimes the best response to unreasonable authority is to simply say no and let them escalate themselves into oblivion. If you've made it this far in the story, and you've got your own HOA horror story, drop your city in the comments below because I'm genuinely curious if there's another Karen out there who can top calling in a helicopter for a curtain inspection. And remember, if someone demands to enter your home without proper authority, you have every right to refuse, though hopefully your spouse isn't the one who'll be answering when they inevitably call 911. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe if you want to hear more tales from Sunset Ridge, and remember, the only thing necessary for the triumph of HOA evil is for good neighbors to comply without question. Peace out, and may all your curtains be whatever damn color you want them to be.
That's the end. Or is it? BD Stories always has another plot twist hiding behind the next click. Hit subscribe, smash the like, and keep going.